Russian President Vladimir Putin visits the front while Washington's diplomatic drive to end the Ukraine war intensifies. U.S. officials are in Moscow after winning Ukrainian backing for a 30-day ceasefire. Is the war nearing an end? And what are the obstacles? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. U.S. President Donald Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine within a day of taking office. That didn't happen. Instead, it was replaced with a new target of 100 days. Ambitious or not, Trump's diplomatic engine is in top gear, an indication of how high a priority he has made ending Europe's worst conflict since World War II. American officials have secured agreement from Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire and have been in Moscow to discuss the proposal. Russia has been winning on the battlefield, gaining more ground, but at a significant cost in lives. Ukraine has been rattled in the diplomatic arena, with President Zelenskyy ordered out of the White House after a media conference ended in a shouting match. But Kyiv retains rock-solid backing from the EU and UK, despite threats briefly enforced by the US to cut off military support. So, how are the diplomatic and military cards stacked right now? Is an end to the war in sight? And on what terms for both sides? We'll discuss all this with our guests shortly. First, though, this report from Laura Khan.
A surprise visit to Russia's western Kursk region by President Vladimir Putin and a show of military strength. He says troops have retaken most of the territory Ukraine seized in a surprise cross-border incursion in August.
Indeed, our task is to complete the defeat of the enemy as soon as possible in the entrenched territory of the Kursk region. They are still fighting there. We need to fully liberate the territory of the Kursk region to restore our borders.
Russia has been guarded about the US-drafted ceasefire proposal Ukraine accepted after meeting in Jeddah last week. It includes a 30-day halt in fighting and a possible prisoner exchange.
We are not going to play with the narrative spread by Russia worldwide. And I want to reiterate that we want to end this war. And I want the American president to see it. I want the American people to see and feel it. Europe and everyone will have to be in this agreement to compel Russia to end this war.
The White House has made it clear that the onus is on Russia.
We have a full ceasefire if it kicks in. We have to see. It's up to Russia now. I think that would be 80% of the way to getting this horrible bloodbath finished.
President Trump warned that the US could damage Russia in a financial sense without explicitly stating what he meant. It was a departure for Trump, who had spoken favorably about Putin in recent days, less so of Zelenskyy, whom he accused of not being ready for peace during a heated meeting at the White House.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
But while the high-stakes diplomacy progresses, so too does the fighting. On Tuesday, Ukraine carried out a major air assault, launching hundreds of missiles and drones in several regions across Russia, including Moscow. Russian attacks are ongoing in the Black Sea port of Odessa. The Kremlin believes it has the upper hand in the war, holding around 20% of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. President Putin's calculation will involve working out how a ceasefire benefits Russia or whether it helps Ukraine, whose forces are under pressure on the battlefield. And President Zelenskyy may consider the difficulties of a deal, which may mean conceding territory to Ukraine's neighbour after all the sacrifices his people have made since Russia's full-scale invasion. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
So let's bring in our guests. From Kyiv, we are joined by Peter Zalmayev, the Executive Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Leonid Ragozin is an independent journalist who specializes in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He joins us from Riga. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Anatol Lieven, the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. A warm welcome to all of you. Our discussion today is really about strategy and how wars end. And Peter, I want to start with you. You are an analyst in Ukraine, but you're also obviously a Ukrainian national with family there, with property there, with a life there. And I want to ask you this. Is it time for Ukraine to cut its losses, acknowledge that it has lost about a fifth of its territory to an outside invasion, because that is what it was and continues to be, and still move to a peace deal with its aggressor?
A very loaded question. Obviously you have to dissect, what you mean by the 20% territory loss, whether that would be a de facto or a de jure recognition of that, because the latter would have a severe impact on international law as such. That would create a precedent that, might makes right. You move in, you take over the territory of a neighboring, weaker, smaller state, and that in itself becomes a norm. Ukraine might actually be at peace with the idea of, exchanging that loss for a promise of solid guarantees of security, investment, economic development. But then you also run into trouble. What exactly constitutes the 20%? And will that 20% all of a sudden balloon to, let's say, 25%? Because Vladimir Putin considers the rest of the four areas of Ukraine that he's occupying partially, Donbass, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia, as part of the constitution. So wouldn't he demand in his, reply to the proposition that the Americans and Ukrainians have made to the Americans, that to the Russians, move out of the rest of this territory and then we'll make peace? That would create an even worse precedent, that Ukraine would have to cede those cities like Kherson that it fought back and reconquered from the Russians at the cost of thousands of lives of its soldiers. And as you mentioned in the preamble to this program, that could create significant discontent on the part of the returning soldiers, veterans, etc. And that in itself, I think Vladimir Putin is very cognizant of and actually would not mind chaos in Ukraine, whether through elections or such concessions that would become essentially capitulatory and very costly politically to President Zelenskyy.
Okay, so you're saying essentially it depends what that peace would look like, and that's what this discussion is going to be about. Leonid, as Vladimir Putin considers his options, bearing in mind that Russia militarily has the upper hand in this conflict, what are the factors that you think could sway him towards making a peace deal?
I believe that, speaking about the territories which Peter mentioned, for Vladimir Putin, territory is not the main issue. The war is not for territory. The war is for the future security architecture in Russia. And I think Putin quite genuinely sees this war as existential for Russia. So when it comes to the occupied territory, this is a bargaining chip, and this is also the punishment Russia is inflicting on Ukraine for what it sees as intransigence.
Right now you have multiple world leaders. You've got Donald Trump, you've got Vladimir Putin, of course you've got the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy. They're all wondering, they're all asking themselves, what is my goal? What can I reasonably achieve? And what might I have to compromise to get there?
Putin, I think, believes that he has all the trump cards on his hands. The Russians have been continuing their slow advance in Ukraine for many months, for over a year. And this is what is probably going to continue if no peace deal is achieved at the moment. So the calculation for Putin is that every time, with every month of fighting continuing in Ukraine, Ukraine is losing. And the deal that is feasibly attainable by Ukraine is getting worse with each month. The Ukraine continues to remain in the battle. So Putin is just waiting for Kiev to to admit that there is no way out from this war except negotiations. And negotiations as Russia sees it, which probably presumes the Istanbul framework, as per the negotiation that took place at the beginning of the full-out invasion.
Okay, everybody put a pin in that. We're definitely going to talk about Istanbul in just a moment. Leonid, you're saying essentially that the way Vladimir Putin sees it, time is playing in his favor, and as the war continues, he is getting a stronger hand, not a weaker one. Anatol, you've written that Russia does have a strong interest, actually, in making a peace deal. Can you explain?
Well, I think Russia has a strong interest in a new relationship with the United States, leading in turn, Moscow hopes, to a new security architecture in Europe. And of course, Trump is notoriously volatile and impulsive. I mean, if he thinks that it's Russia that is wrecking this peace deal that he very much hopes for, then, he is capable of reacting very badly against Russia. I mean, I myself think that the terms of a deal are gradually becoming clear. But I hope that Leonid is right about territory not being the key issue for Putin, because if Russia, as Peter has said, if Russia sticks to this demand that Ukraine withdraw from the territory it still holds in these 4 provinces that Russia claims to have annexed, then there cannot be a peace deal. No Ukrainian government could possibly agree to that. So my hope is that Russia will abandon that demand.
And Anatol, pause for a second. I want to make sure everybody's following you on that. So what happened is that Russia has annexed 4 regions in the east of Ukraine. But Ukraine, of course, doesn't recognize that. And Ukraine says that, and international law doesn't recognize that either, I might add. And Ukraine says, with the backing of international law and Europe, and until recently the US, that is still Ukrainian territory. But what we're talking about is the fact that Ukraine still actually holds a chunk of the regions that Russia says it has annexed. And several of you have mentioned, well, Vladimir Putin might actually make the demand that Ukraine withdraw from what is under international law, its own territory.
Well, he has demanded that.
Yes.
But as I say, that's completely unacceptable. But of course, both sides set out, as always in negotiations, maximalist positions to start with. Until very recently, Ukraine was demanding that Russia withdraw from all the territory that it held in Ukraine, which was also simply not going to happen. So we have to see, in the next round of talks between Russia and the US, just what Russia still demands, what it's prepared to compromise on.
Leonid mentioned Istanbul, and I knew this was going to be an important part of the conversation. My question is going to be whether the Istanbul Protocol of 2022, and I will explain to our viewers what that is in just a second, whether that might still end up being a blueprint for peace negotiations, because both the U.S., specifically Steve Witkoff, has said this could be a guideline for peace negotiations. So, a reminder, Istanbul Protocol 2022, this was a couple months after the war started, and there had been a negotiation. And as we understand it now, parties came fairly close to agreeing to this. The terms, roughly, are that they're very favorable to Russia and are that Ukraine should become a neutral state. It should not join any military alliances, so no more NATO. It shouldn't have any foreign troops or weapons on its territory. It would also it would see the significant shrinking of the Ukrainian military such that it could no longer defend the country in case of attack. And there are other things, but you get the picture. Highly favorable to Russia. Ukraine said no. This was the beginning of the war, and the rest is history. The war has dragged on for 3 years, and now Russia and the US are saying this could be a blueprint for negotiations. So Anatol, back to you. Is Istanbul like a realistic framework here?
Well, some of it is because the Ukrainians said yes to a couple of things. They said yes to a treaty of neutrality. Zelenskyy said publicly that he had gone to Washington, the other main NATO capitals, and asked, can you guarantee that Ukraine will be a member of NATO within 5 years? And they'd all said no. And so Zelenskyy then said publicly, well, then why not a treaty of neutrality with guarantees? And the Trump administration has already ruled out NATO membership what Ukraine is now asking for and what people are negotiating is the guarantees. The Ukrainian government also agreed that Ukraine, and nobody else, by the way, not just the West, but the Indians and Chinese, nobody will legally recognize these Russian annexations. But the status of the Russian-occupied territories would be left for future negotiation. Cyprus, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, could be a precedent there. Nobody has ever legally recognized it, but the war has not resumed. Where no agreement was reached, amongst other things, was on precisely this issue of Ukrainian force reduction, because the Ukrainians, of course, naturally, categorically rejected their forces being reduced to a level where they couldn't defend Ukraine. But we don't know now what Russia will ask for in this regard. It's possible that Moscow will scale this down, for example, simply to a ban on long-range missiles in Ukraine. But that would leave Ukraine free to develop the whole range of defensive weapons with which, in fact, it has fought the Russian army to a near standstill. So there are all these, Istanbul is a framework, but there are all these points of detail that still have to be negotiated.
Peter in Kyiv, thanks for your patience. I know you wanted to come into this conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this kind of formula, and that we keep hearing from the Russians, and Reuters is now reporting actually that Russians have prepared ostensibly a set of responses to the Saudi talks proposition by the joint one by Ukrainians and Americans, and that once again includes this formula of solving the root causes of this conflict, and that is a standby. That's kind of a way to say that, yes, not only would Ukraine pledge never to become a member of NATO, but countries like Central Asia and elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, countries would basically wind down their involvement with NATO. Remember, that was Putin's demands from the get-go. He actually, before ordering his troops to cross the Ukrainian border, he said, NATO should withdraw from these former members of the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland and Slovakia. I guess that was my understanding of his formulation. And so Ukrainians deep down do not trust Putin. And, despite the jubilation that we're hearing now from the Ukrainians that, things happened in Jeddah, and it seems to be in Ukraine's favor. America is resuming its aid, and the Russian now, the ball is, as Rubio, the Secretary of State, said, the ball is in Russia's court. I think it's a bit premature to celebrate and to feel that Russia is on the hot spot. This may be just part of some kind of an agreement, and I would expect Russia to be very careful in its response. It does not want to come across as the warmongering party. Let's imagine the scenario where Russia agrees to this 30-day truce and then comes back with maximalist demands, no to NATO, complete neutrality, no to independent foreign policy, recognition of the 20% loss of its territory. Let's not forget that this exactly is what Donald Trump and his acolytes have been saying all along. So all such jubilation is premature. We're in a very, very early stages of it. And once again, don't forget, we're talking about a ceasefire. We have not even approached the idea of a full peace agreement.
Well, actually, you raise a great point about the ceasefire. Leonid, I wanted to ask that question. The logic right now, what we're talking about is a 30-day temporary ceasefire, right? No more fighting. And that is supposed to create a window of opportunity for deeper negotiations for a permanent end to the war. The idea is you go for the low-hanging fruit, temporary ceasefire, and then you get the ultimate prize. Does that logic even work? I mean, I ask you this because we saw that a similar logic at play in Gaza, and it didn't, or it hasn't so far. So is that a realistic and effective first step as far as you're concerned?
Well, it could be a realistic first step. It doesn't mean that Russia is going to agree to ceasefire immediately. And the reaction from Moscow that we heard today suggests a sort of a very ambivalent attitude. On the one hand, Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, said that Russia is not in favor of immediate ceasefire. It's in favor of a long-term solution. On the other hand, he didn't reject it out of hand. And he said that this joint American-Ukrainian proposal needs to be adjusted, taking into account Russian interests. So the conversation has started. This is what is important. And Russia, of course, will try to insert various concerns and various demands into this conversation, which is going to continue in Moscow today with Trump's envoy potentially meeting with Vladimir Putin. As Peter correctly mentioned, Russia is not interested in alienating Trump's administration, is not interested in showing itself as a warmongering party. On the other hand, it's quite obvious that immediate ceasefire is disadvantageous to Moscow, which is continuing its military offensive all along the front line. There will be this negotiations, maybe prolonged negotiations and highly technical negotiations about the terms of ceasefire. And in this process, a broader framework might emerge, which may or may not be looking like Istanbul framework.
Anatol, you heard Leonid say there that Putin wouldn't want to alienate the Trump administration. You've written, the Trump administration has so far played its cards in the Ukraine peace process with great skill, and that includes the White House episode of berating Zelenskyy. So where many have seen improvisation, you see skill. Explain that.
Well, I mean, it's been crude, very crude, but it's been effective because, we have to remember that until recently, until then, in fact, Ukraine was still setting conditions for peace that could not possibly be fulfilled. And the Ukrainians needed to be moved away from that. The question now is whether the Russians, through continued US aid to Ukraine, but also through the US offer, though still a vague one, of a completely new relationship with America, whether the Russians can be moved away from their impossible demands. That is what we are now waiting to see. But Leonid is quite right. The Russians have always said that they're opposed to a temporary ceasefire. By the way, the Ukrainians were also previously, because they want, they don't want to be seen to have the responsibility of restarting the war if their basic conditions aren't met. And so they want as many things to be nailed down as firmly as possible before a ceasefire.
Peter, Kyiv is caught in this whole thing between an intransigent Moscow and a rather unpredictable America. These two great powers, and Kyiv is trying to navigate this to try and get to an outcome that is, if not favorable, at least where it loses as little as possible and gets the best outcome possible. What is the path for Kyiv, and what demands can it continue to hang on to?
I think it can and should hang on to the demand that there are solid guarantees of security that Russia will not be encouraged to
What would those look like?
I think that Ukraine should continue to insist that whatever reconstruction that takes place of Ukraine, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, it takes place with Russia's money that's frozen in Europe to the tune of $300 billion. That is absolutely, I think, a given. And I think Ukraine should insist that it should not repeat the very sad example of Belarus, the neighboring Belarus and Georgia, the two countries, I think, that have, sort of serve as an example of what sort of sovereignty, quote unquote, Russia foresees for Ukraine. Ukraine gets to keep its flag. It gets to keep its seat at the United Nations. Don't forget that Ukraine was a member of the UN, even while it was a constituent part of the Soviet Union. But de facto, it does not have control over its foreign policy. It does not have a control over its alliances, etc., and it does not have much of a standing army to speak of. Ukrainians have said loud and clear that this is not going to be acceptable, and I think that's what the message should be.
Leonid, you heard Peter they're saying, well, at a bare minimum and to begin with, the reconstruction of Ukraine should be done with the frozen Russian assets, right? About $300 billion that are currently in European banks. Now, interestingly, European countries, like some are obviously calling for that money to be used, but others, and it was the case of the French government that hosted multiple military chiefs of staff just a couple of days ago, are quite tepid about the idea of using Russian money to rebuild what Russia destroyed in Ukraine?
Well, interestingly, there is a chance that Putin's government could be also keen on this frozen money to be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is one of the things that is definitely negotiable in the peace talks that may or may not proceed this year. Kremlin considers the frozen money to be essentially lost. So if as part of these peace talks it is arranged that this money could be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine, then it will be happy to do so. There were signals from Moscow to that effect. They did mention that part of this money they want to spend on the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, but that's also negotiable. So on this side, we can expect some goodwill from Moscow.
Anatol, we're going to run out of time, but I want to ask you about the possibility of peacekeeping troops on on Ukrainian territory, something which Russia has staunchly opposed so far, especially if they are European troops.
No, Russia has not opposed international neutral peacekeeping troops.
They don't want Europeans, I believe.
No, it's the European, because they see that simply as, NATO membership and NATO military presence by another name, which is, what Russia has always categorically opposed. But a peacekeeping force under United Nations aegis, provided by neutral countries like India or Brazil, I don't think Russia has any problem with that. And that, of course, opens up wider possibilities of a peace treaty under the United Nations, some form of new consultative process for Europe under the United Nations Security Council. I mean, given a measure of imagination and intelligence, I think that a solution to that is there. You also have to remember, by the way, that Russia has invested huge effort in wooing, what they call the global majority, we call the global South. Everybody's talking about, a force that can defeat a new Russian attack or maybe a Ukrainian attack. But I think what you need to recognize is that Russia would be deeply unwilling to do anything that would kill Indian peacekeepers and ruin its very important relations with India. So that is also a potential real defense for Ukraine.
Yeah, that's all the time we have for today. There are still, of course, many, many questions left. But thank you very much to all our guests, Peter Zalmayev, Leonid Ragozin, and Anatol Lieven, for really explaining the strategic thinking in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington at this point in the talks. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X, our handle, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.